Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Cryptoverse. Today we are going to discuss how Ethereum has just been rejected from its bear market resistance band. If you enjoy the content, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Also, for anyone interested, I am planning to host a conference later this year. If you would like updates about it, you can visit bjmnc.com/conference, enter your information, and we'll keep you posted once more details are available. So, in this video, I want to talk a bit about Ethereum. It's been a while, and if you are unfamiliar with how I have expected this whole Ethereum cycle to play out, the basic idea has always been that Ethereum would eventually go home before making new all-time highs. Once Bitcoin dropped below its 50-week moving average in November, it became pretty clear that Ethereum was effectively done for the November of the cycle and would return to its regression band. One interesting thing, and I've mentioned this before, is that I made a video about Ethereum's logarithmic regression trendline around 4 or 5 years ago. I think the first version was released in 2019. Back in 2021, when we extended the regression line further out, I remember thinking that according to the model, Ethereum's fair value wouldn't even exceed $2,000 until around 2026. That's a sobering thought when looking at the market. That's why I spent such a long time saying Ethereum would need to go home before reaching new all-time highs. But after Bitcoin topped in October, Ethereum clearly entered a bear market. Now it finds itself roughly at that fair value logarithmic regression trend line. A lot of people are capitulating on ETH, and honestly, the market represents all of us. People often believe they won't be the ones to give up on an asset, but eventually the market reflects collective psychology. When Ethereum spends 5 years barely making new all-time highs, people start losing patience. If you think about it, what have holders really achieved by holding Ethereum over the last 5 years? Not much. Sure, there was some yield, but in many cases, simply holding cash performed better than holding ETH. That may not be popular to say, but it's true. What I'm looking for with Ethereum is a couple of things. I've said for a long time that Ethereum would likely revisit the lower part of its regression band this year, much like it did at the end of 2019. That's where it ultimately bottomed before rallying, and then we entered a recession. To be clear, Ethereum could revisit the lower portion of the regression band, roughly corresponding to the April 2025 low, without necessarily meaning we're in a recession. However, if it breaks significantly below the regression band, similar to what briefly happened in 2020, then we'd be entering recession territory. You can't really have a recession without lower asset prices. And when I talk about lower asset prices, I'm not referring to crypto. Most people in the world don't care about crypto. Ethereum could fall much further, and the majority of people still wouldn't notice or care. I'm talking about the stock market. In a late business cycle environment, riskier assets get hit first. That's why Bitcoin topped earlier, and why altcoins topped against Bitcoin all the way back in 2021. The cycle is playing out in stages, it just hasn't fully reached equities yet. Now, if Ethereum drops to the lower part of its regression band and there still aren't obvious signs of a recession, I'd start expecting a significant counter-trend rally from that area. What's interesting is that during the last cycle, Ethereum bottomed in June. Since I'm making this video in May, part of me wonders whether history could repeat itself. Maybe Ethereum finds a low in June again. I still think the most likely scenario is that crypto bottoms in Q4 and Bitcoin probably bottoms in Q4 as well. But individual altcoins may bottom earlier, so I'll start looking for potential lows in Ethereum as early as June because that's what happened last cycle. For Ethereum to revisit the April 2025 lows, Bitcoin would probably need a larger correction. What's interesting though is that Bitcoin already briefly went below the April 2025 lows, while ETH/BTC continues bleeding lower. I think the most likely scenario is that the ETH/BTC pair keeps drifting down, potentially revisiting previous lows. Why is ETH/BTC bleeding? Fundamentally, I believe Bitcoin is simply a better asset than Ethereum. I know many people disagree, but that's my view. If Ethereum were truly superior, why has ETH/BTC consistently made lower highs since 2017? Yes, you could argue it's made higher lows, but the most recent one wasn't particularly convincing. It's not unreasonable to think ETH/BTC could eventually make a lower low as well. Even if Bitcoin is fundamentally stronger, Ethereum can still have periods of outperformance. Like last year after Ethereum returned to its regression band and then rallied sharply. But those periods don't last forever. Another major factor is monetary policy. At the start of the year, markets expected rate cuts. Now those cuts have largely been priced out, and investors are starting to worry about possible rate hikes instead. When looser monetary policy disappears, higher risk assets bleed into lower risk assets. That's exactly what we're seeing now. Ethereum, being higher risk, is bleeding against Bitcoin as expectations for monetary easing continue getting pushed further into the future. If you look at the previous cycle, ETH/BTC performed well when interest rates were falling consistently. But now inflation concerns are returning due to geopolitical tensions, rising oil prices, and increasing energy costs. As inflation fears rise, markets shift from worrying about recession to worrying about inflation reacceleration, and tighter monetary policy hurts high-risk assets the most. So if Bitcoin revisits $60K while ETH/BTC remains in a downtrend, Ethereum could easily revisit the April 2025 lows, even if Bitcoin itself stays relatively elevated. This cycle is unfolding very similarly to the last one, just on a larger scale. In September 2019, ETH/BTC had a relief rally before rolling over again. We've seen something very similar now. Back then, the rally began after quantitative tightening ended and after Ethereum returned to its regression band. I think ETH/BTC likely continues bleeding because of tighter monetary policy and because Bitcoin remains fundamentally stronger. That doesn't mean Ethereum can never outperform. It just means this probably isn't one of those periods. Right now, Ethereum has been rejected from the bear market resistance band, and I think the most likely path is lower toward the bottom of the regression band. The 2019 analogy lines up surprisingly well. After Ethereum went home, it rallied sharply before eventually collapsing and getting rejected repeatedly by the bear market resistance band just like today. Then it bled into the lower regression band before staging a strong rally. So maybe Ethereum eventually has another sizable rally later on. But in the short term, I think it likely revisits the April 2025 lows. I've said for a long time that during 2026 we'll probably spend much more time inside the regression band than we did last cycle. Back in 2018 and 2019, the market spent a long time consolidating there before eventually breaking out later in the election cycle. If the analogy continues, that could imply a bigger breakout much later, potentially closer to 2028. So yes, Ethereum could revisit those lows as early as June. If that happens, we need to pay attention to where we are in the broader economic cycle. If there's no recession, the lower regression band could potentially mark the bottom. But if a recession occurs, then obviously the outlook changes. In the short term, though, the setup seems relatively straightforward to me. I know it's dangerous to sound overly deterministic, but a lot of the deterministic calls I've made over the last few years, Bitcoin dominance, Ethereum going home, and so on, have played out fairly well. So I think the next move for Ethereum is probably a return to the April 2025 lows alongside further weakness in ETH/BTC. One more thing worth mentioning, when you overlay Japanese interest rates with ETH/USD, you'll notice that many major ETH capitulation events happen shortly after the Bank of Japan raised rates. We've seen that repeatedly, and now the Bank of Japan may raise rates again in June. If that happens, we could see another sharp liquidation event in ETH before it eventually tries to build a base again. So those are my thoughts on Ethereum. If you enjoyed the content, make sure to subscribe to the channel and give the video a thumbs up. Also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at Into the Cryptoverse. Come link in the description below. We discuss crypto trends, but also commodities like gold and silver, along with stocks, bonds, food prices, and broader macroeconomic trends. And if you are interested in the first ITC conference, make sure to check that out as well. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.